So one movement which was left out, that is ethnic movement in India. So we will try to understand what is ethnicity. Okay, and then we will try to see what are the different type of ethnic movement. This will be very helpful for your essay also in general. Apart from that, it is useful for your GS paper also. Okay, so we will see what is ethnicity first. The relationship, you can see the first paragraph, this is just an introduction. The relationship between individual and society is mediated by a number of processes which binds individuals with the group. One such source is the process of identification. Okay, individuals' association with a particular group is seen on the basis of individuals' identification process, which is generated by some commonality. So we all will be identified on the basis of some commonality. This commonality can be like language, it can be a caste, it can be religion, it can be region, or anything. It can be broadly culture also. Okay, so we will identify, for example, if some people come to South India, then there will be a difference between North Indian, South Indian, right? So like that, again, based on caste also, there are different commonalities on the basis of which you will be identified in the society. So one such important process is actually identification, and identification is basically through commonality. Essentially, this commonality is rooted in tradition as something which is transmitted to the person from past. Such traditions thus form the basis of commonality and is known as ethnic identity. So this is nothing but the ethnic identity. So when we talk about ethnicity or ethnic identity, it is nothing but commonality which is transmitted from tradition. It can be anything. So ethnicity means it can be any commonality. It can be religion, it can be region, it can be culture, it can be language, it can be caste, it can be anything. Language or history or anything can be ethnic identity. Okay, so some common forms of such tradition are common language, history, religion, region, and even broadly culture. So this is what I mean by ethnicity. Thus, an ethnic group is bounded by some shared experience in terms of tradition. So when we talk about an ethnic group, it is based on some shared experience in terms of tradition. So when we talk about in terms of tradition, it is nothing but commonality. And what is the commonality? Commonality in terms of language, history, religion, region, caste, or anything. Okay, ethnic identity or ethnicity is generally understood by using two criteria. Firstly, composite marker, that is a complex of different traditions. So when we talk about composite marker, different traditions, all these may be put together, or it is a combination. So that is culture. All together we understand as culture. Okay, so many identities will be part of this when we talk about composite marker. Otherwise, individual marker, it can be based on individual tradition. Means it can be either based on language, or based on history, or based on religion, or based on region, etc. It can be individual marker also. Or the combination is what you call as composite marker. That is broadly we can understand as culture. Like when we talk about South Indian culture, North Indian culture, right? So there is a composition in that. There is a history part is there, language is there, region is there. Okay, so many things are actually involved in composite marker. Ethnicities can have further two types. Real ethnicity, which gradually emerge its own. That is sui generis. So all these things emerge its own. Second is more important, imagined or constructed ethnicity. It is deliberately constructed for the purpose of mobilization of people. For example, when for the election, etc. For the mobilization, you construct a imaginary ethnicity. You will tell that we all belongs to this particular community. We have this commonality, so you have to vote for us, like that. Ethnicity also become the basis for involvement of people in collective action. So you can mobilize people for the collective action for the fulfillment of some interest. That is what we have discussed yesterday as social movement. Mobilization of people for the fulfillment of some purpose, collective action, that will become social movement. Here, if it is based on ethnicity, it is ethnic movement. So ethnic movement we are going to study under social movement. Okay, so if ethnicity is the basis for a collective action and if it is sustained, if it is organized, then that is ethnic movement. In India, the ethnic movements are based on both real and imagined ethnicity, and quite often it is very difficult to separate them. Paul Brass, this is something which you have to write in your answer. You cannot afford to miss this. There's actually the 3 different types of ethnic movement. Paul Brass, in his book Ethnicity and State, mentioned 3 types of ethnic movement. So this is what basically you need to explain in your answer in detail. Intra-ethnic movement. So intra means it is within a group. Intra means within a group, right? Inter means between group. Between group, like inter-college festivals, like that. Okay, interstate. So when we talk about inter-ethnic group, means we can talk about interstate issue also, because state is on the basis of language. Okay, so language is a commonality, language is a identity, so language can also be part of ethnicity. So that can be one example. Then third one, ethnic group versus state. So these are the 3 different categories. Now with intra, this is not that significant in Indian context, because not that within ethnic group the the issues or the movement is very rare. For example, when we talk at international level, or broadly when you talk about Shia Sunni, this conflict can be understood as intra-ethnic group, because it is actually happening within the same identity, within the same ethnic group. This is actually happening, right? Religion can be considered as an ethnic group, okay, because religion is an identity. So anything which is based on an identity can form the ethnic group. So ethnic movement in general are based on feeling of discrimination and threat. So any movement, in fact, it is not necessarily ethnic movement. Any movement is based on some, we have discussed about theories of social movement. It could be strain, it could be relative deprivation, but there are some positive movement also. But here it is basically based on discrimination and threat. The threat of marginalization in the developmental process and relative deprivation is often fit by these movements. Okay, so marginalization in the developmental process, the benefit of the development is actually not reaching to some section, some ethnic group. Okay, especially when we talk about tribals. Tribals are also part of ethnic group, right? So they are the real ethnic group because they have some commonality, they have the common culture and many things. So towards the end, I will discuss about tribal movement also as part of ethnic movement, because they are the real ethnicity. The pure example of ethnic movement is actually tribal movement. Okay, so and relative deprivation is often fit by these movements. These general causes are coupled with particular grievances like administrative inconvenience. Okay, in the case of ethnic group versus state movement, administrative inconvenience, that is in case of one particular group, one particular section versus the state. Ideological superiority in case of inter-ethnic group movement, between ethnic group like Hindu versus Muslim. So this is two religion. Two religion means two ethnic group. We can consider it as two ethnic group, right? So that is considered as based on ideological superiority. A quest for political dominance, particularly in the case of intra-ethnic movement. Like in case of Shia Sunni, I've told you, between them, it is a quest for political dominance mainly. Okay, in India, in intra-ethnic group movement, in India, the intra-ethnic group movements are not very prominent at broader level, but do exist in specific areas. So this is one example, Shia-Sunni conflict among Muslims. But this is not much important in Indian context, because within the group, the movements are actually rare. In the case of inter-ethnic group movement, the manifestation can be seen at the regional level, in which two different ethnic groups are in the state of conflict. So two different ethnic group means you can talk about any, it can be on the basis of language, it can be on the basis of religion, it can be on the basis of caste also. So any identity you can take here. All are examples of inter-ethnic group. So for example, nativist movement in Maharashtra, okay, the Muslim versus non-Muslim. This is Muslims versus non-Muslim in Jammu Kashmir, insider versus outsider in northeastern states, etc. All these are, examples of inter-ethnic group movement. The ethnic movement of the third type are most prominent in India. The roots of these movements lie in the gradual consolidation of British rule, leading to submergence of different identity in the Indian nationalism. Although these identities often converge in the freedom struggle, but the traditional identification continued resulting into India being a multi-ethnic state. Okay, so India is multi-ethnic state means this is India. So within this, there are different identities, and all these identities are actually coming together in the same state. Okay, so that is actually the problem, and later you can see state reorganization movement, etc. Immediately after independence, different ethnicities were combined into political administrative units called states. This resulted in a threat to identity, ethnic identity, in certain cases, which firstly manifested in the form of state reorganization movement. So, state reorganization movement, language was taken as the broad criteria here. So, language is actually taken as the commonality or identity or the part of culture for reconstituting these identities. After state reorganization, a large number of such movements could be seen and were based on numerous demands. In India, mainly three types of such movements are there. So now here, we are talking about in India, what are the main three types of movement which is seen after independence especially. So firstly, movements demanding regional autonomy. For example, there is a state, okay, so within this regional autonomy, that is what intra-state movement. Within the state, intra-state movement, regional autonomy between north and south, or this may further lead to separation of state also. Okay, second is movement for formation of separate state. Okay, it can be interstate movement or it can be broadly understood as separate state movement. Okay, demand for secession or insurgency movement. Now this is what again we discuss when we discuss about regionalism also. There are three types of regionalism. Intra-state regionalism, that means within state. For example, when you talk about north versus south, within a state, okay, UP or any state, if you take within state, that is what intra-state. Then interstate regionalism is there, that means between state, like Kerala and Tamil Nadu. This is interstate, or North Indian versus South India. So this is what interstate. Third is supra-state. Supra-state regionalism means this is actually secession movement, that you need to be freed from the country, that type of movement. So that is again exactly the same as what we're actually discussing here also. So because region is an ethnic identity, so regionalism is what actually I'm discussing here. It is nothing but the same you can apply in case of regionalism also. Demand for cessation of insurgency movement. So this three. So we have discussed about basically now. First we have discussed about intra-ethnic group, then inter-ethnic group, then other case also secession. So here also we are talking about the last category, three types. Okay. Ethnic movement in terms of purely individual marker are considered as ethnic movements by the Western scholars. What do you mean by this sentence? It is actually some movements in terms of purely individual marker. It can be only language or only caste, like backward caste movement, okay, or only religious movement. All these are what you mean by individual markers, individual identity. But in case of Western scholars, they consider this as ethnic movement. Okay, but for the why? Because these are identities. Ethnic movement conceptually means based on identity, commonality. But for the purpose of analytical convenience, Indian scholars tend to differentiate between these and the broad ethnic movement, because in India, a lot of such identities are there. So it is very difficult to study each and everything. So broad ethnic movement means it is based on composite marker, based on culture. So generally, the movement based on composite markers are only considered as ethnic movement in India. Okay, for example, if it is caste-based movement studied under Dalit movement, regional agrarian movement studied under peasant movement, religious movements are not considered as ethnic movement, that is considered as communalism. Okay, so in India, we are studying only composite marker based movements as ethnic movement. In West and Western scholars, if you see, they consider even individual marker also as ethnic movement, because when we talk about ethnicity, it is nothing but identity. Identity is actually traced from commonality. Okay, so this commonality can be anything. Okay, it can be language, it can be region, it can be religion, it can be anything. Okay, any identity, it will come here. So if it is based on language, the movement based on language, for Western scholars, this is considered as based on commonality, based on identity. So based on ethnicity, so it's a ethnic movement. Similarly, religion, region, etc. But in Indian context, since there is a lot of diversity, Indian thinkers consider, for the purpose of understanding it in a better way, composite markers as the ethnic movement. In that context, the best one will be the tribal movements, because this is based on some composite marker. Tribal identity is based on so much of points, identities or commonalities. And this can be a separate question also for you. Here, this part itself can be a question. If ethnic movement is asked, you need to write this much what we have discussed, all those 6 categories, then you need to talk about this. Otherwise, this can be a separate question. Then also briefly, you need to talk about what all things you have discussed and come to this. Tribal movements in India are often based on strong identities which are rooted in tribal culture and geography. Generally, tribal identity are considered to be the real ethnicity. Okay. Thus, the tribal movement in India also being understood as the ethnic movement. In the pre-independence period, the tribal movement often demanded benefits from British in the form of forest rights, non-interference from the outsiders. Like I have told you in case of Santhal rebellion, etc., it is basically because of the problems by the outsiders, the exploitation of the Dikus, right? Exploitation by the Dikus. They started exploiting, they started grabbing their agricultural land, forest land, cultivable land, started exploiting the tribal women, and reduction in revenue. So these were their actual demands before independence. Now, post-independence, the scenario actually changed, that we have discussed in the chapter of tribals. Now, some studies, Raghavaiah list around 70 tribal revolts between this period as cases where tribals launched the movement for the satisfaction of their demand. Apart from this, Call uprising has been studied by J.C. Jha, Santhal movement has been studied by K.K. Dutt, and Kuki uprising by Bhadra, and made conclusion that these movements are largely due to the consequences of colonial policies. What are these colonial policies? Where we have studied under the chapter of tribal society. We completed that colonial policies. In fact, colonial and post-colonial policies we have done. In the post-independence period, new tribal movements emerged demanding recognition for their languages, preservation of cultural identity, and other movements demanding regional autonomy, separate state, or even cessation from the country. And you can talk about that Forest Right Act that we have discussed in the chapter of tribal society under this. Okay, now this is a question which you can attempt later after your prelims, or those who are not giving prelims, you can attempt it now and you can send to me. Discuss the emergence of ethnic groups in India with special reference to ethnic groups or ethnic movement in India with special reference to tribal movement. So tribal movement is what actually you need to stress on in this part.